Where the motive of the 17th century Spana prosecution poisoners was just to rid themselves of their abusive husbands, there exists another motive for poison, and that is for political advancements. Now, long before the Renaissance trio of Tofana d'Adamo, Giulia Tofana, and Geronima Spana concocted the arsenic-based Tofana aqua, Rome's most prolific poisoner was Lucrezia, and she was active during the 1st century Julio-Claudian dynasty in Rome. Now, Julia Agrippina the Younger was probably the most noble-bred woman in the Roman history. Not only was she the great-granddaughter of the Emperor Augustus, she was also the daughter of the general Germanicus, and she was the sister to Emperor Caligula, she was the wife of Emperor Claudius, and she was the mother of Emperor Nero. There were rumors that Agrippina had killed her first husband, Crispus, to inherit his estate. At the same time, Emperor Claudius had gotten rid of his wife, Messalina, because she was plotting against him. Now, since they were both single, the Roman Senate decided that they should marry to end the feud between the Julia and the Claudius families. Thus, although it was incestuous, Agrippina became the wife of her uncle, Emperor Nero, and this was on New Year's Day in AD 49. Now, earlier in her life, astrologers had predicted that her son would become emperor, that he would kill her. But according to Tacitus, her answer was, he can kill me as long as he become emperor. So powerful and ambitious to see her son Nero become emperor, she eradicated all her opponents, and she killed Marcus Julius Silanus with poison. She eventually persuaded Claudius to adopt Nero as his heir in favor of his own natural son, Britannicus. But when Claudius' favor fell on Britannicus again and he regretted his decision, Agrippina decided it's time for her husband, the emperor, to go. So she poisoned him with a plate of poisonous mushrooms, and just to make sure, the doctor used a poisoned feather to tickle his throat to induce vomiting. So when Nero became emperor, he resisted his domineering mother meddling in the state affairs, and especially when she started meddling in his love life. And then she made the mistake of turning her favor to Britannicus. So Nero decided it was time for Britannicus to go, and he consulted his mother's favorite poisoner, Lucrezia. But when Lucrezia's poison was very slow acting when she experimented upon a slave, Nero beat her himself, and she quickly produced a more fast-working poison. So Britannicus was then successfully poisoned during a banquet in AD 55, and Nero rewarded Lucrezia by giving her estates, and he often sent people to her to be trained in her craft. Now, it is said that Nero himself had took the chance for cyanide to be administered by an enema to his enemies. Nero tried to have his own mother poisoned 3 times, but she was clever and she took the antidote. Then, when an attempt to sink her ship also failed, he finally sent assassins, and they killed her, and this was then staged as a suicide attempt. In all of this, Lucrezia, of course, played a very pivotal role. She preferred Atropa belladonna as the poison, and Atropa derived poison was very popular in Rome. Now, Empress Livia, the wife of Augustus, she used this to murder a few of her contemporaries, and it is said that the Emperor Augustus just preferred to eat figs that was growing on the trees in his orchard. So Livia had these figs smeared with poison. Eventually, when Augustus died, her son Tiberius became emperor. So it seemed that Agrippina had a lot to learn from her great-great-grandmother Livia about interfering in Roman politics as an empress and the effectiveness of poison to eliminate adversaries. After Nero's suicide, Lucrezia was then condemned to death by Nero's successor. It was Emperor Galba, and she was led in change through Rome and executed. Now, spinning the wheel of time forward to the 15th and 16th century, Lucrezia Borgia, the illegitimate daughter of Pope Alexander VI, is generally considered in history as one of the most infamous poisoners. But was she? Perhaps she was only a pawn on the chessboard of her father, Pope Alexander VI, and her brother Caesar. Lucrezia could certainly not be considered as feeble-minded. Besides being proficient in Spanish, Catalan, French, and Italian, she was also literate in Latin and in Greek, and she was very, very beautiful. She was a prized wife for any monarch of Europe, but also to the Albanian princes, and she was married 3 times by her father. When Rodrigo became Pope Alexander VI, he needed allies in the powerful prince families, so he married her to Giovanni Sforza. Now, when Giovanni became superfluous to her family, she warned him and he fled Rome. And then he was requested to annul the marriage. But then he said Lucrezia had an incestuous relationship with her father, the Pope. And the father then said, the Pope, no, the marriage was never consummated. And then Giovanni was bullied by his family to sign a documentation that he was impotent and the marriage was never consummated, so it was annulled. And this actually saved his life. His successor, the second husband, was not that fortunate. In 1498, Lucrezia was married to the Neapolitan Alfonso of Aragon, and therefore she was made Princess Consort of Salerno. Like his predecessor, Alfonso also fled Rome, but she requested him to come back, and when he did, he was promptly murdered in 1500 by her brother Cesar. Now, this marriage was consummated, although it only lasted a few months, and she gave birth to Rodrigo of Aragon, who died shortly before his father's death, but also the boy died at the age of 12. In 1502, then, Pope Alexander married Lucrezia to Alfonso d'Este, the Duke of Ferrara. And in their marriage, she bore him 8 children, and she turned into an accomplished Renaissance duchess, effectively rising above her previous reputation. And she outlived the fall of the Borgias following her father's demise. Now, it is said that Pope Alexander had the habit of poisoning his cardinals so that he could inherit his states. And one night he drank from the wrong bottle of wine. Now, according to Mandel Creighton, in his History of the Papacy, he said, Lucrezia was personally popular through her beauty and her affability. Her long golden hair, her sweetish childish face, her pleasant expression, and her graceful ways seemed to have struck all who saw her. Yet behind this beauty and innocence lay a darker portrait of a woman embroiled in incest, poisoning, and murder, probably conjured up by the enemies of her father. There is no historical basis for the legend that she had a ring which contained poison, but was she a poisoner? Now, the book The Prince, authored by Niccolo Machiavelli, a contemporary of Lucrezia, was the inspiration of what psychologists today refer to as the Machiavellian personality, one of the dark triad personality types. Machiavelli dedicated the book to Lorenzo de' Medici, the father of Catherine de' Medici, the Queen of France, and known in history as well as the most prolific notorious female poisoner. Do you think she had a Machiavellian personality? Let me know in your comments. And please join my Patreon account if you are interested in my opinion in this, and if you want to know more about historical case studies and how they influence us in profiling modern criminals. Now, in neighboring France, a sensational historical poison drama unfolded around another Italian-born princess, Catherine de' Medici, and she was born 2 months before Lucrezia's death in 1519, and she became the Queen of France from 1547 to 1559 by her marriage to King Henry II, and she was mother to the French kings Francis II, Charles IX, and Henri III. Upon the order of her uncle, Pope Clement, the 14-year-old Catherine married Prince Henry, the second son of King Francis of France, in October 1553. 3 years later, in 1536, Prince Henry's older brother and the heir to the throne asked for a cup of water after he played a game of tennis, and the water was brought to him by his secretary, Count Montecuccoli. And shortly after, he collapsed, and then a few days later, he died. And everybody assumed, of course, that he was poisoned. But by whom? Now, when Montecuccoli's chambers were searched, they found a book detailing several poisons. And under torture, he confessed to poisoning Montecuccoli. But who was behind this? Now, Catherine de' Medici was one of the suspects, because at that time, she was already known for having an interest in poisons and the occult. Thus, when her father-in-law, King Francis I, died in 1549, and the dauphin was already eliminated, Henry and Catherine became the King and Queen of France. Yet King Henry II had no interest in Catherine, and he preferred his mistress Diane de Poitiers. Eventually, since France needed an heir, after a marriage of 10 years, and bearing the humiliation for 10 years of not being able to conceive and fulfill her queenly duties, in 1544, Henry and Catherine's first son, the first of 10 children, was then born. Now, unlike Agrippina, who had to scheme to secure the throne of Rome for her son Nero, Catherine's sons were already bloodline legitimate heirs to the throne of Henry II. However, the Guise faction, cousins to the king, laid claim to the throne, and throughout her reign, Catherine had to fight teeth and claw to keep the Valois bloodline on the throne. Ironically, the Duke of Guise, Francois-Lorraine, through his maternal line, was a descendant of Lucrezia Borgia. And another threat to the throne came from the Protestants, led by the Bourbons of Navarre. Now, King Henry's sudden death, accidental death, during a jousting tournament in 1559, placed the 40-year-old Catherine, who had not been allowed to meddle in state affairs by her husband, in the role of Queen Mother to the 15-year-old Francis II, who a year prior had been married to Mary, Queen of Scots, who was the niece of the Duke of Guise. Now, scarcely a year later, on the 5th of December 1560, King Francis then, this young son, died, and the Privy Council then appointed Catherine as the governor of France, the regent for her 10-year-old son, Charles IX. At this stage, the young Prince Henry of Navarre, the son of King Antoine de Bourbon and Queen Jeanne d'Albret of Navarre, lived in the household of Catherine because she was his godmother. Now, their destinies were to become entwined in a very unexpected twist. Unbeknown to Catherine, besides her sons, she was raising a future great Protestant king of France. So by 1553, France's religious wars had escalated due to the Duke of Guise being assassinated. Not only did the Catholic Queen Catherine have a rival in the Protestant Queen Jeanne of Navarre, but also England's Queen Elizabeth I, who had supported the Protestants financially, then stepped up and sent troops to France, primarily due to circumvent Catholicism being spread and the Spanish expansion. So in 1563, Catherine's son, King Charles IX, became of age, but Catherine did not surrender her reign, and she dominated her son in affairs of the state. In 1567, the Protestant Huguenots then rallied under the leadership of Queen Jeanne of Navarre at the stronghold of La Rochelle. And Catherine of Navarre, was now the widow of Catherine's previous ally, Antoine de Bourbon. Now, Jeanne's 15-year-old son, Henry III of Navarre, then joined his mother and the Protestants, so he was deserting Catherine's Catholic court. "We have come to the determination to die, all of us," Jeanne wrote to Catherine, "rather than abandon our God and our religion." Catherine then called Jeanne, whose decision to rebel posed a dynastic threat to the Valois, the most shameless woman in the world. Now, despite despising Jeanne, Catherine desired a marriage between her daughter Margaret and Henry of Navarre, Jeanne's son, with the aim of uniting the Valois and the Bourbon interests. Margaret, the intended bride, in the meantime had a secret affair with the Duke of Guise. When Catherine found this out, she dragged Margaret by her hair from her bed, and together with her son, King Charles, they beat her terribly. Eventually, Queen Jeanne of Navarre acquiesced to the marriage, provided that her son Henry would remain a Huguenot. Now, the wedding entourage arrived in Paris in June 1572 to shop for clothes for the wedding, and it's then alleged that Catherine had arranged with her personal perfumer to sell poisoned gloves to Queen Jeanne, who died shortly afterwards. And the groom, her son, Henry, then became King Henry III of Navarre. So despite Queen Jeanne's death, a month later, the wedding still went ahead between Margaret and Henry, and Margaret had to be dragged to the pulpit. Okay. Now, 3 days after the wedding, and of course the death of Queen Jeanne, Admiral Coligny who was a Huguenot general, was assassinated, and this ignited the Bartholomew massacre in Paris, which soon spread through the rest of France, and thousands of Protestants were killed. It was rumored, of course, that Queen Catherine was behind this. Now, King Henry of Navarre was then forced to convert to Catholicism to save his life, and it is rumored that he said Paris is well worth the mass. 2 years later, in 1574, King Charles died, and then Queen Catherine's favorite son, Henry, the Duke of Anjou, became king. When Catherine's youngest son, Francis, the Duke of Alençon, died of consumption in 1584, Catherine no longer had any sons to be heirs to the throne. Now, King Henry was still on the throne. But Catherine fell in, and she was confined to her rooms in the Château de Blois. What she did not know was in the dungeons below her rooms, on the 23rd of December in 1588, her son King Henry III had the Duke of Guise and 8 of the Guise members of family hacked to death. A few days later, she was told about this, and Catherine de' Medici then died on the 5th of January 1589 at the age of 69. Now, at Château de Blois, where she died, Catherine's personal workroom, they found 237 small wooden cabinets, and this was described as her personal apothecary, where she could keep her collection of poisons. Yet, historians are of the opinion that she could have used this for personal correspondence. 8 months after Catherine's death, her son King Henry III was assassinated, and there were no more Valois heirs left. So the crown went to King Henry of Navarre, the husband of Margaret, who became King Henry IV of France, and he reverted back to become a Protestant. Now, was Lucrezia Borgia and was Catherine de' Medici poisoners or not? In a previous video, I discussed that up to the 19th century, it was virtually impossible scientifically to prove that somebody had been poisoned, and even more difficult to prove who had poisoned them. The Spana prosecution in Italy a century prior proved poisons such as aqua tofana was readily available to be sold all over Europe. Now, South African researchers Retief and Sillier, in a 2000 article called Poisoning During the Renaissance, the Medici and the Borgias, and they said, our assessment of the extent of the nature of their poisoning showed that they were indeed products of an era characterized by intrigue, violence, and assassination, but that the roles of poisoners have probably been exaggerated. Knowledge of poison had improved little since the Roman times, and there was still a close association between witchcraft, sorcery, and poisoning, but arsenic had become the most popular poison. Okay, so they said there is limited evidence of Medici involvement in poisoning, with the possible exception of Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, who collected poison and frequented astrologers, wizards, and known poisoners, and she could have poisoned a limited number of her enemies. Okay. The Borgias were involved more directly, although even here their legendary prowess with cantarell powders is overstatement. Pope Alexander had the reputation of poisoning his cardinals, as we already know. His illegitimate son, Cesare Borgia, was ruthlessly ambitious, but many of his victims died due to strangulation and stabbing rather than poisoning. The infamous Lucrezia Borgia was a pawn in the power of her father and her brother, and not a significant poisoner. Now, historians warn us that the reputations of Lucrezia and Catherine could be tainted due to misogyny. Not being able to prove that Lucrezia and Catherine were poisoners does not mean that they were not. Are we likely to believe that Lucrezia was not because she was beautiful and Catherine was because she was referred to as the Serpent Queen? What is true for Livia, Agrippina, Lucrezia, and Catherine, our Italian princesses, are that they were royalty, and although suspected, they were not persecuted for poisoning their adversaries. There was simply not enough proof. But this did not exempt the commoners like Locusta and the poisoners of the Spana prosecution. During the following century, the affair of the poisoners rocked the court of King Louis XIV of France, and this time noble ladies were not spared from prosecution. An interesting fact: when Clare Booth Luce was the United States ambassador to Italy from 1953 to 1956, she became a victim of arsenic poisoning due to the continual flaking of arsenic-based paint from the embassy dining room falling into her dinner, and she was forced to resign her position because of ill health brought on by that exposure. Thank you for watching. Give us your thumbs up if you like our videos and join our channel. If you want to learn more about profiling criminal minds, then join my Patreon account where I share my 30 years of experience with you.